I can't say I've ever eaten dinner inside a water tower, but that hasn't stopped me trying to turn the old town water tower here into a 5-star restaurant. It's a really beautiful old building, and maybe the city council have decided that we're going to keep that, and in this case I am the city council. So welcome back to Waihi, guys. Before we start with the water tower, I'm going to set the scene with the neighbourhood that's going to sit directly underneath that water tower. There's some really heavy inspiration coming in here from Melbourne. There's a lot of row house apartments that sit really close to the downtown, and as well as the beautiful trees that are lining the streets, these make for some really pretty alleyways. So I'm going to turn this little area here just on the inside of this main road into a block for the very wealthy. If you guys want to skip straight to the building of the water tower, just skip to about 4 minutes 50 in the video. So for those of you with a really keen eye, you've probably already noticed that there's a bit in the background that has been built up and I haven't got any footage of it or shown you guys any footage of it yet. That's because I was a silly bugger and I did things backwards with this episode for reasons that would bore the hell out of you, to be honest. So I'm just going to kindly ask you guys not to look in the background. Do not look in the background at all. You're going to see me build that a bit later in the episode. This is also going to be the last episode of Waihi for a little while. I'm going back on a run with Europe in detail. I'm itching to get back into Portugal and get that all finished up. I'm also thinking about giving City Skylines 2 another whirl. I like what Sully's been doing with it in particular. He's really sort of starting to push the game in terms of props and custom buildings and stuff. So yeah, we'll see how we go there. You may see an episode drop in the near future. I'm also going to quickly apologise for the lack of content or the lack of sort of consistency, because 2024 for me so far has just been crazy. I've had everything happen to me all at once and it all just equals less time at the computer, unfortunately. I absolutely love City Skylines. I'd love to be at the computer playing it more, editing these videos for you guys, but yeah, stupid life gets in the way sometimes. So the block here is really starting to shape up. We've got most of the buildings in at this point, and I really want to make this an exclusive area. So they're going to have their own little wee parks and nature areas. You can see the train line is pretty close to this neighbourhood, but it's actually down about 7 or 8 in-game meters from where this neighbourhood is. So the sound and things like that shouldn't affect the neighbourhood too much. We're also going to create a bit of a sound barrier with some nature along the embankment there. So I've coupled together some really small bushes really closely together and then just copied and pasted them across the embankment. I think this looks pretty cool. It's a really simple little trick, but it's a good way of hiding these ugly little cliffs in game too. So some of the other things we're going to add around here as well are like a playground area, because there'll be a lot of children that are growing up in the neighbourhood. None of these row houses really have any backyards, so it would make sense to have some sort of a playground here where the neighbourhood kids go and hang out. So I'm just going to chuck down a vanilla one actually, but I'm going to use Bob to change all the trees. Now, I want to give a little bit of a shout out to someone who commented on one of the last episodes saying, why didn't you just Bob that off or whatever? And I had actually completely forgotten that I had that installed. Yeah, and I'm trying to work out how that person even knew that I had it, because there was no user interface for it. I had to go into the options and find out what the hotkey was to bring it up. So yeah, whoever that was, well played, sir. The other thing we're going to want to introduce here is lots of trees, and that means on the streets as well where people are going to be walking. These streets can get really hot. Like for instance, the ones in Melbourne, you know, they're on a very narrow street. 99% of the building facades are block, masonry or plaster, and most of them also have a brick front fence. Now that's important because brick, stone and cement based substrates in general retain heat, lots of heat, and at 3, 4, 5 o'clock when it's absorbed all of the heat from the sun during the day, and it might be 30 plus degrees, it's going to radiate that out really quickly, and these streets become like standing next to a heater. So it's very important to get trees and shade in here. So first things first, in terms of the water tower, I needed to find a really nice looking one on the workshop, because if we've decided to keep it in the city, then it's an icon. You know, it could be the era it came from, it could be the architectural style that it's followed, And also it needs to be quite large, because if we're going to turn this into a restaurant, then, we can't have it 5 square meters. Like my dad said, if it's not big enough to swing a chicken round in, it's not worth it. Actually, my dad never said that, but it makes a lot of sense to have a restaurant that, is proportionately how you would consider a restaurant. So there'd be at least 15 tables, I would think, and that's a large water tower. Lucky I found one. This one's awesome too. It looks fantastic, and the next port of call is I need to create 2 versions of it because it's going to be heavily PO'd. I want to have sections of the facade glass so that we can see directly into the restaurant, which means removing a lot of the brick facade that comes as default. I've chosen this little wee square block here right at the top of the hill. We could imagine that maybe originally this was a perfect spot for a water tank. Maybe it was gravity feeding a lot of the buildings and neighbourhoods around. And the small nature of the block puts a nice emphasis on the building. It's sort of standing alone in the middle of this block. It's on quite the slope still though, so I'm going to use stairs and retaining walls and some surfaces to make it look like it's meant to be, and sort of being an icon in the city, I'm going to make it really approachable from most sides, so lots of stairs leading up to it. It's very prominent and easy to get to. So once we've got all that sorted, the next port of call will be to break down the model and create a flat surface where we're going to have the restaurant. This is why I need 2 versions of the building, because the bottom up to that surface will represent one of the models and the other one will be the top of the restaurant. Most of the time when we use procedural objects to modify a building and open it up in this case, you find out that only one side of the building has been rendered, so once you get inside you can't see the back of the facade. And in this case there's no ceiling in here, so I'm using another version of the roof, flipping it upside down, flattening it somewhat, and then just putting it back in place so that we don't see right through the roof from inside. This is pretty much the basic shell of the building complete at this point. I'm not going to install any glass until we've finished doing what we're doing inside. Next, I'm going to use Sully's pedestrian paths and run one up here and put a raised entertainment area up here because I want real people coming up to the restaurant. They might not be eating a meal, they might just be standing around, and that might look a little bit awkward, but I still think it's pretty cool. So let's give that a little bit of time. I want to see what happens. I want to make sure people are using the path properly and make sure the raisable entertainment area is set to the right height. So while we wait for that to happen, let's build out a couple of blocks directly adjacent to the water tower. Alright, we're in business. We got people up in there, so now we can carry on and actually detail all of the inside of the restaurant up. Rather than do all of that inside the building, which would be really fiddly, I'm going to copy a version of the floor out, over and onto the terrain, where it's easier to place the props down and just work around it in general. At this point, I don't really know what to put in terms of props, so I'm just going to start with the basics. Things like tables, a bar, and like a room that doubles as like a kitchen or a cooking area. I've got a really nice little prop table here that's got a nice tablecloth on it. It's super appropriate for a hotel or a restaurant, so we'll put that down first. And there's a fair bit of room up here, so we're going to put down quite a few tables. We need to leave some room and some alleyways here and there for the waiters to get about, and I'm just going to use a really basic black prop to create the bar area. It doesn't really need to be anything flash. I'm thinking if I just include the sort of main areas that make it look like a bar, then it should be convincing enough. Next I can move on to some smaller props and more cosmetic things like planters and little doorways and air conditioning vents for the freezer, and I'd like to try and make the bar area a little bit more pronounced or a little bit more prominent, so I'm going to add like a little modified bus shelter over the top of it, and we're going to put some lights in this as well. It should look pretty cool. So the last thing I'll do is I'll put a decal on the ground and turn it a deep maroon sort of a colour and really top it off with some nice high-end looking carpet. I really like the way this sets the mood. I think this looks really cool. So the idea from here is to try and copy all of this over and into our water tower. That's going to be pretty tricky. You can see it's pretty intricate at this point. There's quite a lot of props here. I told myself not to put too many props down, but that just went straight out the window. So here we go, I'm going to transport it over and I'm pretty much going to line this up the good old fashioned way, including the height. I'm just going to have a look real close at one of the chairs and tables and get it as close to our surface in the water tower as possible. The only thing that was a little bit messed up was our carpet that we put down. It needed a little bit of adjusting, but everything else was pretty good, and this just looks cool as up here. I really like this. A couple of people are standing directly in the middle of a planter, but that's okay. We can deal with that. I just think it's really cool nonetheless. So a few things need a little bit of adjusting, and then I'm just going to choose from a couple of different glass panels that I have and then turn one to PO and place those in all of the open spaces. A nice little trick if you're dealing with glass and you want to make it darker, you can just double it up, especially if it's a procedural object. Just copy it directly in its place and leave it there, and it's automatically a shade darker. In this case, I didn't want it too dark because I want to be able to see in pretty clearly. So let's place this glass around in all of the openings and finish it off. We currently have a really high demand for industry, and we're looking at the main port area, or what's going to be the main port area in Waihi. We are going to have a lot of industry down here, including cargo, train and ship hubs. We're going to focus primarily on this one spoke here that's the most predominant, and we're going to turn this into our train to ship cargo hub. This is going to be completely plumbed back into the city. We're going to put all the train lines in the rest of the episode, and I'm going to take a slightly different approach to the way that I do this area, because I have done a couple before. In fact, I actually really enjoy doing these sort of cargo port areas, but I enjoy it a little too much, and I often get way too carried away with the props and things. And this is the sort of thing that always leads to my series ending early, so my new approach here is just not as much detail. Basically, I'm gonna still detail it, but I'm just gonna stick to the main things. And in this case, that's gonna be containers. Lots and lots of frickin' containers. The fact that this area is actually functioning within game and has a purpose as well. We're gonna see ships and stuff come in here. That animation alone, that counts for a lot of detail. I don't really need to overdo this area. So because this is all functioning within game, we're going to have a lot of traffic generated from this area, so I want super efficient connections to the highway. These have probably been built up and upgraded over many years and decades, but we're going to have a section of this that's been upgraded to an elevated highway. It's going to follow that same sort of nice curve that the train line has taken on its way in. And all of that is really just following the shape of the terrain. It starts to get very steep towards the downtown from here. So you can see there hardly any small props, hardly any decals, nothing like that, just the basics, but I still think that looks pretty cool and it will hopefully prolong the series a bit. So next I'd like to make sort of a rail yard, and I've done a couple of these before, but I've never really used the prop versions of trains to make it look like there's extra trains here that are either waiting for use or they're being serviced or decommissioned or whatever. And there's some really nice prop versions of trains, so I'm going to try that. I'm going to put a few down here. It comes with a variety of different trailers as well to make it look interesting. Some of them are just flatbeds with nothing. There's different coloured container trailers. And I think I've even got like a gasoline or a liquid container somewhere. But you'll see some cinematics of this later on and it looks really cool. So next here you're going to see that I've put a little bit of industrial zone down. This is a really easy way to fulfill some solid demand within the game, because the only alternative is to use cube services and hide them in a procedural object building. But the trouble with that is they have a force level. They don't raise up or down or demolish when there's no demand, whereas the zone buildings do. They will move with the demand. And I have all intentions of putting a big dirty factory over this entire block and hiding all of these buildings. You will not even know they are there. So we're now over at the main train station in downtown. I would like to do the same thing here that I've done over at that little wee cargo rail yard, and we're going to have some passenger trains here that are just waiting to be serviced or not in use at the moment for whatever reason. And this little version I've got here, this is actually from Sydney, but these look so similar to the ones we've got here in New Zealand, in Wellington in particular. And this just looks really cool, even though none of this is really functioning within game. The train station is, but none of this. I still think this just looks really cool. It adds something. So you might also see here that we've got cargo trains coming through from this direction, and this poses a little bit of a problem. Because I've got the highway cutting through here, it's difficult for me to get a train line around and over to that cargo area that we just built. So I'm going to make one of these railway lines here that we've just put in go underground and tunnel around really neatly and over and up to our cargo hub. Turn this awkward little wee block here into a raised public space. I think a green space would go really well here as a nice buffer between that more industrial area down at the port to the nicer area we have above us towards the CBD. There'd also be some really nice views of the harbour from this park. So we're going to have a real pedestrian path come here with some raisable entertainment cubes and dress it up with some nice trees and stuff. Thank you guys so much for watching the episode. It's been really nice in this series, just being able to return to what makes this game fun for me. Waihi really has been a nice blend of all the things I love about the game. Like I mentioned earlier, I am going to return back to Europe in detail. I want to finish Portugal and I'm really excited about returning. And you may see me dabble in City Skylines too. I'd be stoked to hear your guys' comments on that, or any comments at all. I'd love to know what you thought of our little restaurant that we built, and please give me a thumbs up if you can. It really helps me out. It helps other people see my stuff. Have a wonderful weekend guys, and I will see you in the next episode. See you later.